In this video we will talk about lists and what are the data structure called list. The list can contain several elements. Regularly you probably can store number, you can store a string in a variable, but in case you need several elements, for example you need a list of numbers, then we have a data structure called list for that. And in list, in Python, you can have different elements with different data types inside one list. Although it's usually preferred to have only the same type of elements inside one list. It makes the code easier to read and it's easier to maintain. And the elements inside the list or the order of the elements is fixed. So if you have certain numbers inside the list, the order of the elements remains the same. And what you can do with lists, you can add elements to a list, you can remove elements, and you can change the value of different elements. Let's see how we can use lists in Python. So here's an example. We'll first create a variable empty list, which will become an empty list. And you can see we write the list with brackets. You start with a bracket and you end with a bracket. And for example, if we want to add several elements into list, we can just separate them by comma. And here are examples of a list of numbers and a list of names. And basically both lists contain 4 elements. It's just an example. You can have how many elements you want. So elements are written inside brackets and the elements themselves are separated by comma. And if you, for example, want to know how many elements are in the list, you can use function called len, or like length. And for example, if you have a variable numbers and we want to print out the number of elements inside it, then we can use len and add the variable inside this function. As was mentioned, you can have different data types inside one list. Here is an example of a list where we have one number, one integer number, one string, and one floating point number. And you can do that, but it's harder to maintain the code. In these examples, for example, you want to take the elements out of the list and you maybe want to calculate something based on that. And if you have numbers and strings, you have to do some extra filtering or you have to validate before using the element, whether it's a string, whether it's an integer, and so on. In some programming languages, you cannot have different data types inside one list. It can be for some people inconvenience, so you cannot use different data types in one list, but actually it should make your code easier to maintain. So in Python, although you can have different data types inside one list, it is preferred to use only the same type inside one list. So how to access element in a list? We can also use brackets here. So, and inside the brackets we will specify the index. So like the position, which element we would like to access. And in lists, as also in strings, the indices start from 0. So the first element is always with the index or position 0. And the last element, because we start from 0, is not the same as the length, but it's one less than the length of the list. And indices are integers. So for example, we have a list of numbers, then if we want to access or print out the first element, then we have to use the index 0. If we want to get the last element, then it's the index is 2 and so on. So I will just write the same thing on the board. So if you have a list of 1, 2, and 3, if that's our list, then the indices are 0, 1, and 2. So because we start from 0, the last element is always length minus 1. That's the index of the last element. And if we try to access element or the index which is not inside the list, we will get an error. So if we try to get the element at position 3, then we get an error. What Python does or allows us to do is to use negative indices. And the negative index is counted from backwards. And I will just, the last element has index -1. And here are the examples. So if I use the same example, then the indices here would be -1, -2, and -3. And basically, if you want to access, for example, this element here, we can use, let's say it's the numbers or num_ner is the variable, then we can use 1. This uses this index, normal index, starting from 0, or we can do -2. And especially if we want to get the last element, it's more convenient to use -1 than to use length of nr -1. You can compare. So it's very convenient in Python. In some other programming languages, you don't have this convenience, and then always you have to calculate the length and take 1 off of the length. So this is very convenient in Python. So, but if we want to change elements, then we can change the element at certain position. And we can use the same index logic here, and we just assign a new value to a specific element. For example, I can write that let's change the second element to 7. Now what happens is that first it finds out the element here, so it's basically this one here, and it assigns 7 to this position. So basically this one will be changed to 7 here. This is the example, basically changes the first element of the list. And it first we print it out at the position where the printing takes place. It's still 1. The first element is 1. Then we change the first element into 5, and after printing the first element, then it's changed to 5 already. Variable. In Python, variable, for example, this variable here, it holds the position or points to the list in memory. So basically it's a reference to the list. And if we assign the same list or the same list into another variable, for example, that's x, we will assign these numbers into x, then those both point to the same list basically. What it means? It means that in case we change elements by this variable, for example, we change the element here to 7, then it's the same for the x variable or the x list. So basically we can think of it as those variables are pointers to memory, and if we change something in memory, then it changes to every variable which points to this position. So here's an example. We basically have the same list. We will assign the numbers into another numbers, and if we change first element of numbers list into 5, then both lists have this first element as 5. So this is it's nice to know that. So if you want to have a copy of a list, then you have to make a copy especially. So you in this scenario, their copy is not made, and you have to take into consideration that if you change something here, it changes for the same list here.